I hear great things about you and your team in Waterford, and it's nice to put a face to a name. Um, so yeah, look, my name is Donagh, and I'm I'm a counsellor. Sometimes counsellors are referred to as psychotherapists or therapists. I generally just call myself a counsellor. I suppose a mental health professional. Um, and I'll start with a little bit around, as Lucinda was kind of saying, some of the misunderstandings or myths sometimes that are out there about counselling, and just talk a little bit about that, and then I'll talk about stress and what that is, and the impacts of it. Um, so when people ask me what do I do, or kind of what do counselors do, I sometimes struggle with that. But essentially, we meet people and we talk with people and we listen with people and about their lives, about whatever is going on in their lives. Um, it doesn't have to be. Sometimes people think it has to be something that they perceive to be major, in terms of something where they're really having a mental health crisis, or that they're experiencing a bad bout of depression or kind of something like that. Yeah, that's part of what we do, but very often it's really just talking and listening with people about whatever's going on, and really, I suppose, trying our best to help people to cope with the reality of what's going on for them as individuals. And that's a hugely varied thing. It very much depends on it, and I'm going to refer to a few times this evening to this idea of what goes on for people on an individual level or a subjective level. It's a very personal thing. When I come to talk, I'll talk a little bit about stress in general, but then people experience stress in different ways, and there's lots of different variables involved in that. So it's a stress, and how we deal with it is a very personal thing. Up until mid-March, I was I live in Waterford. I practiced in I had an office there in Waterford City, which I had practiced in for 11 years up to mid-March. But with the initial lockdown, I that had to cease. So I've since gone online and offer, kind of like a lot of my colleagues did, a lot of counsellors did, offer online services or telephone services now, which is is great, because now I can meet with people actually from all over the country, rather than just a southeast kind of demographic around things. So oftentimes people, making the approach to a therapist in the first place is oftentimes the hardest thing for people, just to kind of say, put their hand up and say, struggling a bit, could do with a chat, don't really know what this is about. And that's fine. Like, why would you, or how would you? When I first went to therapy, 25, 30 years ago, I didn't know what that was, what that involved, or what that was about. I just knew that I needed a bit of help around something. So people do not have to be in any way, in terms of really struggling with their mental health. Oftentimes the conversations that go on in therapy are just that. They're conversations between two people, and around trying to, one thing therapists try to do is help people increase their self-awareness around kind of what might be potential stressors in their lives, what might be things that are making them feel bad, or things that they think, the psychological kind of aspect of things. And I'll come to that in terms of how that then can contribute to what we call stress. So there, I think it's in my 20 years of practicing, I've noticed that people are more open to the idea of just having a chat with someone, to something that's private and confidential between myself and yourselves around things. It's and rather than sometimes we might feel that we're burdening another person, a loved one or a family member or a friend and stuff, that we, with counseling, what we talk about is kind of private and confidential, and it goes no further. And then as well as that, then sometimes some therapists like myself also work in proactive ways around helping people to cope with things like stress. But the usual initial kind of things then are like, an initial meeting, getting to know each other, kind of whatever on that level. And then me and the person I'm working with figuring out that might need to change, or things that are stressing us or causing us stress, or kind of, and yeah, so that's kind of what I do, and kind of what counselors try to help with. So and as Lucinda was kind of saying, it's to me, it's not possible to separate out so much about, like, whether if we have a physical condition, or if we have a chronic illness or something around that. It's not, to me, it's not possible to separate that out from the psychological and emotional impact that that's going to have. We're all human beings here, so we all have kind of parts of us that are the psychology kind of part, like the thinking part of our beings, if you like. And then another part is our emotional kind of side. And then we have the behavioral side, how we behave, what other people see, how we do or don't kind of act around things. And all of that then happens, yes, within our physiological body, obviously. So all of those four components interact all the time. If you could think of a cycle, and there's four parts in that cycle. One part is the thinking part. So those are the things that are the self-talk, if you like, that constant kind of chatter that goes on in our heads for all of us, that internal kind of dialogue. That's one part. Then we have our emotions, which are our feelings, our moods. And there's a constant interaction going on between our thoughts and our feelings. Those then in turn impact upon our behavior, whatever we're doing or not doing. And I'll put that in context when I come to talk about stress in a minute. And all of those three things then within that cycle, all of those obviously happen within our physiological body then. So the physiological health sensations, and again, that's going to tie in with when I'm talking about stress. So a lot of what therapists do is focus on the thinking and the feeling kind of parts, perhaps, and sometimes the behavioral kind of parts. So, and then more the medical professionals perhaps would focus on the physiological, but we work with all of these kind of things. So yeah, that's just a little bit around kind of what counselors do. But yeah, I had been saying, in my years of practicing, I have noticed that people are more open to the idea of having a chat with someone, getting a bit of help. If there was stigma around it, and there might have been, there might have been. I think we're getting better in terms of reducing any stigma. What I find with stigma around going to talk to someone, a lot of that is self-stigma, that we feel that, sure, I'm grand, really. I don't really need to talk about something, or kind of whatever, or I'll just be wasting this fella's time, when there are people who really have issues to talk about, or we feel that we're weak or vulnerable in some way when coming to talk to a therapist. That is not the case whatsoever. So yeah, I'm just going to move on now and talk a little bit about, so when Lucinda said around kind of, will you give a bit of a talk there to the group around stress? I said, grand, I will. And it got me thinking around how am I going to frame this? I think first of all, we might look at what stress is. Stress is a word you hear an awful lot in modern day life. And there isn't a simple, neat definition of it in terms of the word that we all kind of hear and bandy about. In one aspect, stress, just the word alone, stress is a normal part of being a human being. We all need a certain amount of stress to function, to protect ourselves, to stand up even, we need to put a certain amount, technically we need to put a certain amount of stress on our muscles to be able to stand up. So it's a word that sometimes gets used and overused at times around things. So there's such a thing, first of all, before I talk about what we might consider unhealthy stress, we need to recognize, first of all, that there's such a thing as healthy stress. And that's I suppose, the normal thing that keeps us kind of functioning, that keeps us kind of going and coping with life. People sometimes come to me and say, I just want to get rid of all the stress in my life. And I kind of say that, to completely get rid of stress isn't possible and wouldn't be healthy at all. But let's have a look at maybe some of what constitutes unhealthy stress then, and that might be impacting upon you. So unfortunately, there isn't a single kind of definition or kind of a bite-sized phrase that I could give you around kind of stress. But in psychological and mental health terms, I kind of define stress as when we feel unable to cope with a perceived pressure or unable to cope with a situation where we perceive pressure around something. And this then, as I will explain, leads on to a number of different kind of chronic stress then can become quite unhealthy for us. The important word there for me in terms of when I said stress is where we're unable to cope with a perceived pressure is perceived. It depends on sometimes it depends on how we think about a situation or a pressure. So for however many of us are in this forum today, I'm just checking 33 people here, all of us could be placed in a same situation, but not all 33 of us are going to feel the same way about that. Some of us might feel anxious about that particular situation. For other people, it mightn't be a bother at all. But for those other people, you put them in a different situation. And so let's say we put all of us and Norma is feeling quite stressed about one particular situation that we're in, and Lucinda isn't feeling stressed at all. But we might change the situation, and that might be a particularly stressful situation for Lucinda, but not for Norma. So sometimes it's not so much the situation, it's how we view the situation. Sometimes I'm not kind of saying it's as simple as that, but that's an important part in terms of how do we begin to deal and cope with stress. So as I said earlier, some stresses or some stress is healthy and we need it, and that's fine. That's not what we're talking about here. But what we're more interested in, for me talking tonight and in therapy, is trying to identify what might be unhealthy stressors for us, because this is the unhealthy stress then is the type that can cause anxiety or mood issues, and also on a physical level then can, because when we get heightened levels of stress, that sets off various hormones in our system, cortisol being one of them, that if we get too much of that in our system for too long, it can then lead to physiological and mental health issues. And you might have heard of something called the fight or flight kind of response to something. So the fight or flight response is a very primal thing that when we are faced with or let's go back thousands of years when our ancestors were living in caves or kind of whatever. And when they were faced with some sort of a threat to their security, or let's just say they were faced with some sort of a wild animal, a lion or something, or about to attack them, they're going to get they would have gotten an immediate shot of adrenaline, which produces adrenaline, obviously, and cortisol and stress, to get them to prepare to deal with that actual threat. And that's when the fight or flight response kicks in. And that would have been helpful to them back then because they needed to take action. A lot of the time in modern day life, it's not so much that we're faced with a lion or an actual physical threat or danger, but a perceived threat or danger that causes us anxiety. So worry can be one thing, and chronic worry around things or lying awake at night worrying about something can produce lower levels of that adrenaline, that fight or flight and cortisol, but enough then to cause us unhealthy stress. And then as a result of that, sometimes can impact upon our mental health and our physical health. So some of the symptoms, if you like, physiological symptoms maybe of this type of unhealthy stress can be things like increased blood pressure, a feeling of that we can't cope, that we're overwhelmed with something. Fatigue or disrupted sleeping can be sometimes a good indicator, unless there's a physiological reason. But then, like, if, for example, with sometimes with a chronic heart condition, and whereby we might then, if we feel palpitations, like or increased palpitations, sometimes that can trigger a response psychologically for us, whereby we're kind of going, hang on a second, there's something going on here that I need to worry about. The unfortunate thing about worry in that respect is that, if you remember that cycle I was talking about earlier, the more that we start to worry about what if this is something that's really bad, in terms of something that's going to impact upon my heart, for example, the more that we worry about that, the more that increases that emotion then of anxiety, which then in turn actually can lead to an increase in heart rate, not because there's anything particularly physiologically wrong with us, but because the body is coursing through with adrenaline and with cortisol. So other kind of symptoms, worry about kind of generalized type of anxiety around kind of what if type scenarios, worrying about our loved ones or carers, or kind of worrying about the stress that our health condition might have impact upon other people as well as ourselves around things. And then there can be behavioral responses to stress, such as withdrawing from people, becoming more isolated because of worry or stress or anxiety around things. And then other things can come into play in order to, when we're feeling stressed, then we can come up with some coping mechanisms. Initially, in the short term, these coping mechanisms might seem like they're helping. So sometimes we could be self-medicating with alcohol or with food and comfort eating, or we might be engaging in spending too much time online and distracting ourselves kind of that way around things, and getting into some kind of unhealthy coping mechanisms, which in the short term might seem like are helping because they make us feel a little bit better when we engage in those type of things, but longer term they're generally not kind of great for us, because then it leads to a poor diet, or it leads to some kind of what we call self-defeating kind of behaviors or things like that. So one way, so there's a couple of ways in terms of how not people don't have to come to talk to a therapist just to try and figure out some of these things. There are some things now, as I said earlier, I can only talk in general terms around what are some things that we can do to try and help ourselves to deal with stress. Because everything else then is on an individual basis. As I said earlier, something that really stresses Lucinda, the same situation may not apply for Norma, and vice versa. So the same applies for some kind of management around a person's stress. It depends, first of all, in terms of what type of situations stress a person, and then figuring out what they can do about it. Someone said to me once that there was only two types of worry. One worry was things that we can control, and the other worry was things that we can't control. And the thing that's important there is trying to figure out what are the things that we can control. So the first thing I would say is just increasing our awareness around if we are feeling quite some of this unhealthy stress. That's the first step, becoming aware. So some of the indicators might be disturbed sleep, might be kind of feeling stressed a lot, worrying a lot around things, and some of the behaviors then that might go in hand with that around kind of whatever, whether it's self-medicating or overeating or kind of whatever around things like that. Just looking out for some of the indicators. Then once we have that awareness to kind of go, maybe I'm not coping that well with life and its pressures around things, then it's trying to figure out what can I do for myself. And this sometimes is where counselors try and help, is around helping a person understand and figure out what way can they kind of deal with their own particular stressors. So just a few tips. Now, these are very general, as I said, and what works for one person may not work for another person. But some basics are around getting some moderate exercise. Now, depending for yourselves in terms of your own health conditions around that, but generally, moderate forms of exercise can be a good way of de-stressing. Taking a walk or kind of and any form of exercise where you can actually get slightly kind of out of breath and kind of and some sort of aerobic exercise is generally kind of good if that's appropriate for your kind of sometimes with some of the Heart Foundation people that I've worked with in the past, there might be a concern around kind of, but if I take some exercise, then is that not going to impact? And you take advice initially from a medical professional on that, but if the medical professional is saying some moderate exercise is fine, then try and do that, and not to worry then around that might be kind of talking to people then, not necessarily a therapist, but support groups like this, people who have an understanding around kind of what that is, or a trusted friend, or kind of someone where a problem shared is a problem halved. If the corollary of that, the opposite of that, is not talking about how we're feeling or how we feel that we're coping or not coping, and generally keeping things bottled up is not great, because that tends to increase the stress levels that we're feeling around things. So it seems like a simple thing to say, get adequate rest and sleep, but if stress and anxiety is keeping you awake at night, that might seem like a difficult thing to do. And if that does happen for some people, because sleep is really important in terms of our overall general health and well-being. But if that's something that's difficult to do because we can't sleep because we're anxious or worried or stressed, then all the more reason to try and figure out what is causing us that stress and anxiety, and what can we try and do about it. Diet, fairly healthy, fairly balanced kind of diet around things, getting plenty of rest, as I said. And then, so practicing some sort of relaxation exercise. Now, again, that's a very subjective thing. What one person might feel relaxing, and something in a self-caring kind of capacity or a hobby or something, and not to another person, if I was to say to everyone, you know, I don't know, read a book for an hour a night, and that'll work for you in terms of getting your mind off things, or kind of that might be fine for someone who finds reading relaxing. But if to someone else, the idea of reading a book for an hour might be just a complete disaster for them. So you'd be encouraging them then to try and find something that works for them. So having some sort of some time in your day where you can either go somewhere, obviously not at the moment with lockdown and everything else, but it doesn't have to be outside of your house or anything like that. Although, having said that, engaging in nature in some way is generally a good way to kind of de-stress around things. But even a space within your own house where you can get some peace and quiet for 30 minutes or an hour a day, and then practicing some sort of thing that you find relaxing. Some people find mindfulness or meditation to be relaxing. Other people, as I say, read a book or engage in some sort of hobby. Again, trying to find what works for us on an individual basis is really important, because simply different things work differently for different people. I'm almost finished at this stage. Just around, as I say, I can really only talk about stress in general terms for the time being. In therapy, then, the focus is on the individual, around kind of what type of things makes them feel stressed, what are some of the impacts of stress around that. So I suppose my takeaways are that, first of all, we need to define there is such a thing as healthy stress, and that's fine. We can't function without healthy stress. But it's trying to figure out what are the things that cause us to and some of the symptoms of unhealthy stress. So those would be things like chronic worrying around things, low mood, disrupted sleep, fear of talking to someone about our problems, and then once we have getting some awareness around that, then what can we actually do? Because oftentimes, as I said earlier, some things we have no control over, and that sometimes we just have to accept things like that. But then trying to figure out what do we have control over. And one thing that I emphasize with people that we can have control over is how we think about things. Again, our perceptions around things. So I've a lot more that I could have said there about stress, but I don't want to keep you too long this evening. But I am going to be here for the remainder